19th century Latin America is often remembered for wars of independence revolutions and new republics. But hidden in the archives are traces of a story rarely told: how same-sex desire appeared in daily life and how society tried to control it. Court records from Mexico and Brazil list cases of men arrested for indecency. Police reports from Buenos Aires mention taverns where men gathered in secret. Letters between writers sometimes use language that feels more intimate than friendship. Yet sermons, newspapers, and colonial-inspired laws condemn these behaviors, often branding them as crimes. So what do these scattered clues really show? Were they evidence of real communities living quietly, or just isolated moments magnified by officials and moralists? The evidence is uncertain, leaving us with more questions than answers. What's your take? Hidden networks, or just fragments? Share your thoughts in the comments and let me know the time you're watching. If you enjoy history told through open questions, subscribing is your choice. Let's get started right away. Before we begin, take a moment to relax your body and sink into the story. Imagine stepping into a world where the law itself could decide whether your deepest affections were a private matter or a punishable crime. That's the weight you feel in 19th century Latin America, where colonial shadows still hung thick over every street corner and bedroom. The Spanish and Portuguese crowns may have loosened their grip politically, but their legal codes and moral frameworks lingered like smoke long after the fire. You're not just walking through a city. You're walking through centuries of inherited suspicion. Colonial laws against sodomy were carried straight into the 1800s, not as dusty words on paper, but as living threats. Judges in Mexico City, Lima, and Havana could still invoke ordinances dating back to the 16th century. These weren't abstract statutes, they came with very real consequences, ranging from imprisonment to public humiliation. Picture yourself in a society where the same courtroom that tried cattle thieves and counterfeiters could just as easily drag someone in for who they loved. Would you ever feel safe enough to be yourself? The reach of those codes wasn't uniform, though. Independence movements reshaped borders, but they didn't always sweep away the moral debris of empire. In some new republics, like Argentina or Chile, legal reform lagged behind rhetoric of liberty. Politicians promised freedom from Spain, but they weren't about to declare freedom of the heart. Think of it like moving into a freshly painted apartment, only to discover the plumbing is still ancient and leaking. You can claim independence all you want, but the old system keeps dripping into daily life. It wasn't just the law, it was the spectacle of punishment that left its mark. In colonial days, executions for same-sex acts were staged as public lessons intended to terrify. By the 19th century, the punishments had softened, but the fear hadn't. Trials were published in gazettes, whispered about in markets, dissected by gossiping neighbors. The legal system didn't need to hang people anymore. It only needed to shame them so thoroughly that others got the message. Social death became the new execution. Have you ever read an embarrassing headline about someone you know and realized it would follow them forever? Now magnify that by a whole city. And here's the irony. While these laws lingered, enforcement was wildly inconsistent. Some officials quietly ignored what they saw as private affairs, especially if the accused had money or influence. Others cracked down harshly, especially when cases could be exploited for political gain. The law became less about morality and more about convenience. You can almost see the hypocrisy. Leaders who thundered about moral order by day could wink at certain scandals by night. Take the example of Brazil. Even after independence from Portugal, the empire's penal code of 1830 kept certain colonial attitudes alive. But unlike earlier times, prosecutions for same-sex relations became rarer. That doesn't mean acceptance had arrived, it just meant the authorities often preferred silence to spectacle. Yet silence is its own punishment, erasing stories and pushing lives further into shadow. Imagine a history book where whole chapters are missing because someone decided not to write them down. That was the fate of countless lives. And still queer existence found ways to endure. In the gaps between laws and enforcement, people carved out lives sometimes cautious, sometimes daring. They lived knowing that the colonial shadows loomed over them, but shadows, after all, can't exist without light. The fact that authorities kept rewriting, suppressing, and debating these laws shows one thing. Clearly, people kept living in ways the codes couldn't erase. The tension of law and life shaped everything. The whispers on the street, the confessions in church, the rumors that clung to politicians and poets alike. You can feel it even now, reading through trial transcripts or police records where whole lives are reduced to sterile lines of accusation. Behind every document was a person breathing in fear, hoping the colonial shadows would not fall too heavily that day. You feel the church before you even step through its heavy wooden doors. Bells toll above the plaza, priests sweep by in black cassocks, and the smell of incense lingers like a reminder that every street is under its watch. In 19th century Latin America, the Catholic Church was more than a religion. It was the moral compass, the social police, and often the political partner of the state. And when it came to same-sex love, its eyes were everywhere sharp and watchful. The Church's teachings framed desire in narrow terms. Anything that didn't fit the model of marriage, reproduction, and obedience was cast as sin, sometimes whispered about in sermons, sometimes thundered from pulpits. You might sit in a pew, your head bowed, hearing the priest's words dip into warnings about unnatural acts. The sting wasn't just in the doctrine, but in the social ripple it caused. To be condemned in church wasn't private. It was to be judged in front of your entire community. Can you imagine carrying that weight every Sunday, knowing everyone around you was sneaking glances and wondering what your confessions might be? Confessionals, those little wooden boxes meant for absolution, became double-edged. On one hand, they promised secrecy with a priest. On the other, they were places where whispers of forbidden desires might be dragged into the open. A penitent could confess feelings or actions, and the priest would respond with stern warnings, penance, and sometimes a subtle threat: repeat this, and the community might know. For many, confession was not a balm, but a cage, a reminder that even your thoughts were not safe from scrutiny. It wasn't just sermons and confessions. The church ran schools, orphanages, hospitals, essentially every institution that shaped daily life. Children grew up with catechism lessons, drilling in ideals of family and gender. Young men at seminaries were taught vigilance. Young women in convent schools were instructed in purity. Any deviation became a scandal. If someone dared to show affection in the wrong way, word traveled fast through church-run networks. Imagine today's social media gossip, only without the internet. Priests, teachers, and nuns formed a living web of information. And yet, the church was not monolithic. Individual clergy responded differently. Some priests were harsh enforcers, using their pulpits to denounce and shame. Others quietly turned a blind eye, understanding more than they admitted. History even gives us examples of clergy accused themselves scandals hushed up or buried in dusty archives. The hypocrisy was there for those willing to see it, though few dared speak aloud. Doesn't it remind you of modern leaders who preach one thing by day while their private lives tell another story? Public morality plays often backed by the church reinforced this atmosphere. Cities staged religious festivals and processions celebrating saints and virtues. These events doubled as reminders of acceptable behavior. Step out of line, and your difference stood in sharper contrast against the parades of devotion. Picture a gay man or lesbian woman walking through streets draped in banners of purity and sacrifice, knowing their truth didn't fit the script. The pressure was unrelenting, the message clear: you were being watched, measured, judged. But despite its grip, the church could never fully erase what it tried to suppress. People still found one another, still whispered, still sought comfort in hidden corners. Some even used the language of faith as camouflage. Devotion to a same-sex saint, the act of sharing prayers with a special friend, or the cover of religious brotherhoods allowed intimacy to slip under the radar. Faith ironically became both the enforcer and the shield. So as you step back into the plaza, the bells still echoing, you feel the church's shadow, stretching across every aspect of life. It's in the laws that echo sermons, in the families shaped by catechism, in the fear that confessionals carried. The watchful eyes were everywhere, but so too was the quiet resistance of those who found ways to love in spite of them. You walk down a busy market street, stalls bursting with colors, voices calling over one another, and somewhere in that noise, you catch a word you don't quite recognize. It's not in the dictionary, and it doesn't appear in any official record, yet it's charged with meaning. Hidden languages. That's how queer people in 19th century Latin America managed to recognize each other without exposing themselves to danger. Words, gestures, codes, survival tools disguised as casual chatter. In Mexico City, Havana, or Buenos Aires, men and women who sought same-sex companionship often relied on slang that outsiders couldn't decode. It might be a playful nickname, a twisted version of an everyday word, or a tone of voice that carried an extra layer. Just as Polari served queer communities in Britain, local dialects in Latin America developed their own sly vocabularies. A single phrase at the right moment could mark you as part of an invisible circle. Imagine having to rely on secret passwords just to say you like someone. Everyday life turned into a spy novel. Gestures mattered just as much as words. A tilt of the head, a certain way of flicking a fan, or the deliberate choice of where to linger in a plaza could send signals. Historians digging through police records have found testimonies describing men accused of effeminate walks, or women dressing in masculine clothes. These weren't fashion choices alone. They were semi-coded statements, risky performances of identity in plain sight. Have you ever worn something bold, hoping the right person would notice, even if everyone else didn't get it? Now picture that with legal consequences on the line. This secret communication wasn't always about romance. Sometimes it was about safety. Queer people could warn one another if police were patrolling, if a certain neighborhood was unsafe, or if rumors of a scandal were spreading. A coded phrase could mean "not tonight" or "don't trust him." The language wasn't only playful, it was protective. In a world where exposure meant shame or arrest, these words became shields as much as invitations. And secrecy bred creativity. In some cities, underground communities developed entire slang systems tied to professions. Sailors, for example, picked up terms in ports that blended Spanish, Portuguese, and African languages, mixing them into private codes. Market vendors used humor and double meanings. Even theater actors, always skirting the line between performance and scandal, built backstage jargons that let them joke and flirt beyond the ears of authorities. It's a reminder that culture doesn't only survive in books, it thrives in whispers and winks. One striking example comes from Rio de Janeiro. Police reports mention young men gathering in certain taverns where they used nicknames and playful banter to mask their intentions. Outsiders might dismiss it as rowdy drinking talk, but insiders knew the real meanings. These weren't just jokes, they were lifelines. If you've ever had an inside joke with friends, you know how it bonds you instantly. For queer communities, those inside jokes could mean survival. Of course, the risk of misunderstanding was high. Say the wrong word to the wrong person, and suspicion flared. That's why humor often became the vehicle. If caught, one could laugh it off as a joke. Double meaning was the art form, ambiguity the shield. It created a world where communication was always layered, never simple, always walking the tightrope between exposure and invisibility. The beauty is that traces of this hidden language still survive. Oral histories, fragments in police files, even lines of poetry hint at the codes once used. They remind us that even when silenced by law, and church people found ways to connect, language itself bent to their needs, creating a parallel universe beneath the official one. So, as you leave the crowded market, the chatter fading behind you, you realize you've just stepped through a living dictionary that never made it into print. Every word you didn't quite catch carried a story, a risk, and a spark of solidarity. A hush settles as you step across the polished floors of an elite salon, chandeliers glowing above, and velvet curtains drawn tight against the night. Here's the hook behind the glitter of crystal glasses and the polite laughter of aristocrats. You find affections that dared to bloom where they were least expected. The longhouse may have been smoky survival, but the drawing room was a theater one, where forbidden love hid in plain sight. In 19th century Latin America, the upper classes embraced European models of refinement. Salons gathered politicians, poets, musicians, and intellectuals beneath gilded ceilings. On the surface, these were evenings of poetry readings, piano recitals, and philosophical debate. But beneath the cultured chatter currents of attraction pulsed. Men traded glances across the room, while women leaned a little too close when reading verses aloud. If you've ever been at a dinner party where two guests seem to share a secret, you already know the atmosphere. Art became the mask. Poetry, in particular, offered a safe vessel for emotions that could not be spoken outright. A sonnet dedicated to a dear friend or a noble companion might conceal desire beneath layers of metaphor. Listeners could pretend it was simply elevated friendship, while those in the know caught the subtext. Think of how today someone might post a song dedication that really carries a private meaning for just one person. It's the same play of public versus private message. Some names echo from this era. Cuban poet José Martí, for instance, is remembered as a nationalist hero, but scholars still debate the intensity of his relationships with male companions. His letters, filled with tenderness, walk the delicate line between friendship and something more. Whether or not we interpret them through a modern lens, they remind us how language served as both expression and disguise. In salons, Such writings could be performed aloud, cloaked as literature, while whispering a deeper truth. Music, too, played its role. A song sung at the piano, a duet rehearsed with unusual intimacy, a dance that lingered one beat longer, these were subtle cues. While the dance halls of the working class carried rougher reputations, the salons cloaked the same emotions in elegance. Respectability became camouflage. A lingering hand in the middle of a waltz could hide in plain sight because the music demanded closeness anyway. Yet these spaces were not without risk. Servants observed. Rivals gossiped. A misplaced word could spark rumors that tarnished reputations. That's why discretion was everything. Salons thrived on wit and coded language, letting desire glide just beneath the surface without spilling over. If you've ever tried to keep a straight face while holding in a joke only your friend knows, you'll understand the tension here, except the stakes were far higher. What made salons especially fascinating was the blend of conservatism and rebellion. On one hand, they embodied elite tradition, reinforcing hierarchy and refinement. On the other, they provided rare opportunities for intellectuals and artists to bend norms. Same-sex affection was never the headline act, but it was part of the playbill. It shows how even the most restrictive environments can host quiet revolutions, not with swords, but with verses, gestures, and glances. As you leave the glow of the chandelier and step back into the night air, you realize how these salons, with their crystal and velvet, mirrored the hidden languages of the marketplace. One used slang and signals. The other used poetry and music. Both were different masks worn by the same human longing. You step away from chandeliers and velvet curtains and now find yourself at a street corner, the stones slick from rain lanterns flickering faintly and voices rougher than any salon. Here among soldiers fresh from barracks, sailors off their ships, and laborers at the end of their shift, another side of queer life unfolded. Street corners were the stage of fleeting encounters where class and decorum mattered far less than desire and opportunity. These spaces thrived in shadows. Taverns near port alleys, behind markets, plazas just far enough from the main cathedral, each became known for nighttime gatherings. Police records from 19th century Buenos Aires, for instance, mention young men loitering near barracks and docks, accused of indecent behavior. But when you read between the lines, those accusations hint at entire micro-communities surviving on the margins. Doesn't it make you wonder how much of history hides in plain sight disguised as crime reports? The atmosphere was far from genteel. Sailors, often away from home for months, created tight-knit bonds aboard ships that sometimes blurred the line between camaraderie and intimacy. When they disembarked, they carried that energy into the streets, looking for connection in corners the authorities barely lit. Soldiers, too, were notorious for bending rules when barracks life pressed too close. The camaraderie of drills and shared bunks easily spilled over, though officially no one would admit it. If you've ever heard jokes about what happens on deployment stays on deployment, you're hearing the faint echo of dynamics that were already alive in the 19th century. Clothing played a role here too. While the elite wrapped their secrets in poetry, men on the street sometimes expressed identity through small but noticeable choices: a scarf too colorful, a stance too theatrical, a voice pitched just so. Police descriptions often mocked these signs, calling out effeminate behavior, but the records inadvertently preserved proof that people were making themselves visible even in hostile settings. It was risky self-expression, like wearing a neon sign in a crowd ready to jeer, but sometimes visibility itself was the point. And not all encounters were fleeting. Some men formed lasting relationships forged in these marginal spaces, bonding over shared danger and mutual secrecy. Imagine two sailors meeting at a port tavern, pretending to talk of wages and voyages, while signaling something else with glances. Out of that might grow weeks or months of companionship, hidden in rented rooms or quiet walks. For women, especially working-class women, the story was even harder to trace, but there are whispers. Domestic servants dismissed for too close attachments. Factory workers rumored to share beds out of poverty, but really out of choice. Of course, authorities cracked down. Police patrols targeted known corners, rounding up groups under charges of vagrancy or disorder. Newspapers published lurid accounts painting the accused as moral degenerates. Yet the very repetition of arrests in the same places shows something important: the gatherings never stopped. People returned night after night because human need outlasted fear. Doesn't it sound familiar to how modern nightlife thrives, even when neighbors complain or authorities threaten? The cycle of suppression and return is as old as the desire itself. The street corner carried its own kind of culture. Instead of poetry and music, it was shaped by humor, bravado, and sometimes mockery of authority. Jokes, songs, and bawdy banter created a sense of belonging. Outsiders saw only chaos. Insiders felt community. And in that noisy, rough environment, fleeting touches and stolen words carried as much weight as any sonnet recited in a salon. So when you leave the corner, lantern light flickering against the wet cobblestones, you realize that both the salon and the street serve the same human impulse. One cloaked it in velvet, the other wore it openly in grime. Both carved spaces where love and desire could exist, however briefly, against a world determined to erase them. You hear the commotion before you see it, shouts in a courtroom, the scratch of pens recording every word, and the rustle of papers that will outlive the people they describe. Scandals and trials dragged private lives into public theaters, and in 19th century Latin America, accusations of same-sex intimacy often exploded into spectacles that ruined reputations, even when punishments were light. Court records survive in fragments, and they read like half-finished plays. A neighbor claims to have seen two men too close in a stable. A maid testifies about her mistress sharing a bed with another woman. The language is clinical, but between the lines you glimpse fear, betrayal, and sometimes malice. It wasn't unusual for such cases to begin not with genuine discovery, but with a grudge jealousy over inheritance, anger at a debt revenge between rivals. The accusation of sodomy became a weapon sharper than any sword. Imagine living in a society where a single rumor could drag you before a judge, your name inked forever into the archives. Punishments varied. By the 19th century, executions of earlier centuries had faded, but prison terms, fines, and forced exile remained on the books. More devastating was the loss of social standing. For elites, a scandal could mean political ruin. For the poor, it could mean being branded untrustworthy, unable to find work, ostracized in markets and parishes. If you've ever had a mistake splashed across a group chat or office rumor mill, you know the sting. But here the consequences followed you for life. Take the infamous case of Santiago de Chile in the 1840s, when a group of young men from respectable families were accused of forming a secret society devoted to same-sex encounters. The trial records mix moral outrage with fascination newspapers covering the case as if it were theater. Most of the accused avoided heavy sentences thanks to family influence, but their reputations never recovered. History remembers them less as individuals and more as cautionary figures in moral debates. It shows how courts could devastate without necessarily destroying, leaving lives in tatters through shame alone. Not all trials involved elites. In Havana, soldiers were sometimes hauled before military courts for indecency with fellow recruits. The army, desperate to project discipline, made examples of them. Yet barracks life continued unchanged once the trial ended, proof that punishment couldn't erase behavior deeply rooted in the structures of daily life. The contradiction was glaring. Institutions condemned what they also quietly produced. Trials also reveal glimpses of humanity. In some testimonies, accused individuals defended themselves with unexpected boldness. One man in Mexico insisted his close companionship with another was friendship, nothing more daring the court to prove otherwise. A woman in Lima, accused of sharing a bed with her cousin, admitted it freely, but framed it as necessity. In a poor household, was she covering or quietly asserting her truth? These defenses, even if strategic, remind us that people were not simply passive victims of the system. There's also the voyeurism baked into these scandals. Newspapers and gazettes reported lurid details, selling morality as entertainment. Readers devoured the stories, shaking their heads at immorality while savoring every whispered hint. If you think tabloids today are invasive, imagine living when your trial for improper affections became the city's favorite gossip for weeks. The archives don't tell us everything, but they tell us enough trials were less about justice and more about performance. Judges reinforced social order. Newspapers sold scandal rivals took satisfaction, and ordinary people were reminded what lines not to cross. Yet the very existence of so many cases proves something the authorities would never admit, that same-sex relationships were common enough to stir constant anxiety. So as you leave the echoing courtroom, you can almost hear the quills scratching, still reducing lives to accusations and verdicts. The paper may have yellowed, but the voices remain frozen mid-scandal, a reminder that the fear of exposure haunted every corner of 19th century queer existence. The ship creaks as it pulls away from the dock, sails straining against the wind, and you can almost feel the lump in your throat if you were one of those forced to leave everything behind. Exile wasn't just about geography. It meant erasing an identity from one place and reinventing it in another, whether willingly or under duress. For queer people in 19th century Latin America, exile and escape were recurring themes written not in headlines, but in scattered stories. Sometimes, exile was literal. Courts or communities banished individuals caught in scandal, sending them to distant provinces, foreign ports, or monasteries far from home. In Mexico, a soldier accused of intimacy with another was shipped off to a remote post on the northern frontier, a punishment disguised as redeployment. In Brazil, exile often meant being encouraged to emigrate or seek opportunities abroad, anywhere but in the neighborhood, where tongues wagged. Imagine being told your very presence was the problem, that silence could only be restored by your absence. Other times, exile was self-chosen. A young man from Lima, who couldn't endure the gossip, might book passage to Buenos Aires, hoping the anonymity of a bigger city would give him breathing space. A woman in Havana might join relatives in Madrid, constructing a new life where the whispers hadn't yet reached. This wasn't cowardice, it was strategy. If survival in one place meant perpetual suspicion, reinvention somewhere else became an act of courage. Haven't you ever thought about moving cities just to get a fresh start? Now magnify that by the weight of scandal, and you'll understand their resolve. Cross-dressing in some cases became both disguise and escape plan. Police records tell of women who donned men's clothes, slipped onto ships, and worked alongside sailors. Their motives may have been layered economic opportunity, personal freedom, and perhaps love, but the effect was the same: exile from one identity into another. Some even managed to pass for years, carving new lives in ports from Veracruz to Valparaiso. It makes you wonder how many untold stories were lost, simply because someone succeeded so well at vanishing. Exile didn't always mean distance. For some, it meant disappearing within the same city. They changed names, shifted neighborhoods, sought work under false pretenses. The anonymity of urban growth in the 19th century provided cover. Buenos Aires, Rio de Janeiro, Mexico City. These booming capitals absorbed thousands of migrants. Among them were individuals carrying more than poverty or ambition. They carried secrets, hoping the noise of the city would drown them out. And often it did. Yet exile also meant loneliness. Letters home were cautious friendships severed and family ties strained. To live under another name was to risk being forgotten. Think of the ache when you leave a group chat and wonder if anyone notices. Now imagine cutting off your entire family for safety. The cost was immense, but the alternative, staying visible under suspicion, was worse. But exile could also create unexpected networks. People forced from one city often found each other in another, forming circles of shared understanding. Ports in particular became crossroads of such lives. Sailors, exiles, migrants, all converged, their paths crossing in ways that allowed solidarity to sprout in unlikely places. If the salons were refined and the street corners rough, the ports were liminal spaces filled with people who had already crossed borders of some kind. So when you stand at that dock, watching sails vanish into the horizon, you don't just see distance, you see reinvention. Exile was punishment, yes, but also possibility. It fractured communities, but it also spread them, carrying untold lives across oceans and mountains, stitching a hidden diaspora of love and survival through 19th century Latin America. You leave the docks behind and find yourself in the highlands where wind cuts across ancient stone terraces, and echoes of older voices linger. Indigenous memories carried through the 19th century tell you that queer lives were not always seen as shameful. Before conquest, many indigenous cultures across Latin America had traditions of fluid gender roles and same-sex relationships woven into spiritual and communal life. Those echoes did not vanish entirely. They were buried under colonial and church rule, yet they surfaced in fragments, stubborn reminders of a different past. Spanish and Portuguese invaders condemned these practices as sins against nature, stamping them out with violence and forced conversion. But you can still trace their shadows. Among the Zapotecs of Oaxaca, the role of Muxus people assigned male at birth, but living in feminine roles, survived into the 19th century despite heavy stigma. Travelers' diaries mention them in hushed tones, sometimes mocking, sometimes amazed. They weren't invented in the 20th century. They were survivors from older worlds. Doesn't it make you wonder how much richer history is when we look beyond the colonizers' version? Andean cultures too left traces. Chroniclers recorded rituals and myths that celebrated gender variance, though often through the lens of condemnation. By the 1800s, such stories survived in folk traditions, whispered in rural villages where Catholic priests hadn't fully erased them. A grandmother's tale about a trickster spirit who shifted between male and female, or a ballad sung during harvest that hinted at forbidden unions. These were cultural memories hiding in plain song. You might have heard them and thought it was just a curious legend, never knowing it carried centuries of defiance. For indigenous communities, colonial law was only part of the struggle. They faced land seizures, forced labor, and the erosion of traditions. Within that whirlwind, the survival of any memory of queer acceptance was remarkable. It speaks to the resilience of oral storytelling, where an idea could outlast an empire simply by being repeated around a fire. Compare it to how families today keep recipes alive, one dish passed from hand to hand across generations. Here, it wasn't food, but identity that simmered quietly through the centuries. There were contradictions, of course. Many indigenous leaders in the 19th century had absorbed Catholic morality and repeated its condemnations. Some became agents of repression themselves, eager to prove their communities civilized by denouncing those who strayed from European norms. Yet others quietly held onto different ways of seeing. The result was a mosaic conflicted uneven, but not entirely erased. One of the clearest examples comes from travelers who visited Central America and reported men who lived openly with other men, dismissed by outsiders as oddities, but accepted locally as simply part of village life. Their words drip with colonial judgment, yet the fact that such people existed tells you the memory of older traditions had not fully died. Survival doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. By the late 19th century, intellectuals in urban centers rarely acknowledged these indigenous legacies, preferring European frameworks of morality. But in rural villages, where the church's grip was looser and ancestral voices still murmured, space remained for lives that didn't fit strict binaries. It wasn't freedom in a modern sense, but it was continuity, a thin but unbroken thread. So as you stand on the ridge listening to the wind push across terraced fields, you realize you're not only hearing air and stone. You're hearing memory of muxes in Oaxaca, of shifting spirits in Andean myths, of songs that carried truths no court record ever preserved. The colonial shadows might have darkened the landscape, but beneath them, indigenous memories glowed faintly, refusing to go out. You hear the distant echo of marching drums, flags snapping in the wind, and the fiery speeches of generals promising liberty from empire. Revolutionary currents surged across 19th century Latin America, and with them came dreams of independence, constitutions, and new nations. Yet if you listen closely, you notice what's missing. Freedom was declared for citizens, but rarely for those whose loves fell outside the prescribed order. Revolutionary rhetoric borrowed heavily from Europe and the Enlightenment liberty equality fraternity. Leaders promised to cast off the chains of colonialism to build republics of virtue. But the virtue they meant was modeled on strict heterosexual families, fertile mothers, and disciplined male citizens. Same-sex desire had no place in that script. The silence was deafening. Imagine being swept up in a crowd shouting freedom while knowing the word did not extend to your private life. Would you feel inspired or invisible? Some independence heroes themselves lived with complexities that history politely footnotes. Simón Bolívar, the liberator, projected the image of a virile leader devoted to the cause and to women. But rumors swirled in Caracas salons and Bogota streets about friendships that carried unusual intensity. Whether true or exaggerated, the whispers show how even in revolutionary times, suspicion followed men whose bonds didn't fit easy categories. It's a reminder that revolutions change governments faster than they change social habits. The armies of independence were curious spaces. Young men far from home shared tents, trenches, and barracks. The intimacy of war created bonds stronger than politics, bonds sometimes crossing into affection. Court records from post-war years occasionally surface with cases of veterans accused of indecency among themselves. The irony is striking. The very men who fought for liberty could return to societies unwilling to let them live freely. Doesn't it echo the contradictions soldiers have faced in more recent centuries? Honored for service, silenced in identity, political pamphlets, and newspapers painted the new nations as moral communities, often contrasting their virtue with the supposed decadence of Europe. Same-sex desire became a convenient foil, something to blame on foreign corruption or colonial excess. By condemning it, leaders reinforced their vision of a disciplined republic. In effect, the revolutionary banner carried both liberation and repression stitched into the same cloth. Women felt these contradictions too. As independence movements celebrated the image of the patriotic mother, any deviation drew suspicion. Friendships between women could be intense, filled with poetry letters and shared households. But if they strayed too far from the maternal ideal, rumors spread. Letters between women, like Manuela Sáenz Bolívar's companion and confidant, sometimes carried a tenderness that historians debate. Were they romantic, or were they simply another form of loyalty? Either way, the silence around them tells you how tightly revolutionary ideals policed gender roles. Yet currents of resistance flowed beneath the surface. Some radicals argued that true freedom meant questioning all hierarchies, not only political ones. Small pockets of intellectuals, often inspired by French utopian thought, whispered about new ways of living. Their ideas rarely made it into constitutions, but they show that even in the fervor of revolution, people dared to imagine liberties larger than the ones printed on parchment. When the gunpowder smoke cleared and republics stood in place of empires, the new nations carried forward old anxieties. Constitutions guaranteed rights, but morality laws lingered. Independence parades thundered down boulevards, but queer lives were forced into alleys and shadows. The revolutionary drumbeat was loud, but for many, it drowned out rather than amplified their voices. So as you stand on the edge of a plaza, banners flying, and orators promising a bright tomorrow, you notice the silence hiding inside the noise. Freedom marched forward in uniforms and anthems, but in the private chambers, the hidden salons, and the coded corners of language, other kinds of freedom still had to wait. Dawn breaks over the 19th century, like a hesitant sunbeam, slipping through shutters and catching the dust of forgotten rooms. The parades have ended, the trials have faded, and the sermons have softened into echoes, but the whispers remain. Whispers into modernity carried the lives of queer people from secrecy into survival, from erasure into fragile remembrance. And here's the hook: without those whispers, the present would have nothing to stand on, no thread to follow back through the shadows. You trace them in archives, where a clerk scribbled too much detail in letters, where affection was tucked into metaphors, in police reports that unwittingly preserved stolen moments. Each fragment is a whisper that defied silence. Together, they form a faint chorus, telling you that queer people did not vanish. They endured hidden in plain sight. Isn't it striking that sometimes the evidence of existence survives in the very documents meant to condemn? By the late 19th century, science joined the conversation, though not always kindly. European sexologists published theories that categorized homosexuality as illness, and Latin American elites imported those ideas eagerly. Doctors in Buenos Aires or Mexico City began writing case studies that treated queer lives as curiosities. On paper, they pathologized. In reality, they documented. Ironically, those medical notes dripping with judgment now serve as proof that queer people lived, loved, and persisted despite the stigma. Urban growth also shifted the stage. The rise of modern cities created new spaces, cafes, theaters, boarding houses, where people could blend into crowds. The very anonymity that frightened moralists offered opportunities for connection. A man strolling down a boulevard, a woman working in a garment shop, a clerk renting a room in a crowded tenement, all could slip between identities more easily than in a small village where everyone knew every whisper. Modernity brought risk, but it also brought cover. And with migration came circulation. Ideas, styles, and even coded languages flowed across the Atlantic, carried in newspapers, books, and letters. Parisian novels with queer subtext ended up in Havana, Spanish theater reached Buenos Aires, and rumors of European scandals trickled into Latin American gossip. Local lives were still shaped by law and church, but they were no longer isolated. They were part of a broader, if hushed, global current. Some individuals even began to leave more deliberate traces. Writers, painters, and performers who played with gender roles or celebrated unconventional affections became cult figures, sometimes scandalized, sometimes admired. Their works hinted at what could not be spoken openly, planting seeds that later generations would recognize. Imagine walking through a gallery or reading a poem in 1880, not fully understanding why it stirred you, only to realize a century later it carried the resonance of hidden lives. Of course, silence still ruled the public sphere. Politicians and priests continued to declare the sanctity of family judges, kept their codes, and newspapers thrived on scandal. But beneath the official story, the whispers never stopped. They slipped from salons to taverns, from villages to capitals, from exile ports to crowded tenements. Each whisper was a bridge across time, carrying the memory forward. So when you finally step out of that century, leaving behind the smoke of longhouses, the chants of revolutions, the hush of salons, and the rumble of courtrooms, you carry the whispers with you. They are fragile, yes, but they are also stubborn. They remind you that queer lives were not invented in the 20th century. They were always there, enduring, adapting, and waiting for the moment when whispers could finally become voices. Through the shadows of law, church, and revolution, queer lives in 19th century Latin America endured hidden in markets, whispered in salons, defended in trials, and carried in exile. They were never absent, only obscured their voices, preserved in fragments of poetry, scandal, and rumor. These untold histories remind you that silence is never emptiness. It is survival coded in whispers. Yet beyond these stories, another world was unfolding, just as carefully concealed the secret lives of women in 19th century Latin America. You wake to the faint creak of shutters and the distant bray of a mule in the alley. And you realize that dawn in 19th century Latin America doesn't mean rosy light spilling onto breakfast tables. It means the scramble begins. Hook first, behind every closed door is a secret drama, and you are about to walk right through it. Women stir first, long before men stretch or boys dart into the street. You can almost hear the soft shuffle of bare feet on tile floors, skirt brushing as candles are lit. Coffee beans ground with mortar and pestle, and water fetched from a courtyard cistern that never seems quite full. Your eyes adjust to the dim corridor, where a grandmother mumbles a prayer toward a saint's print, tacked to the wall, while a young girl lingers pretending to tie her hair, waiting for the right moment to sneak in her own whispered request. That kind of multitasking dividing attention between God chores and personal wishes was as common as the rooster crowing outside. Do you ever feel like your mornings are also a negotiation, juggling phone alarms, emails, and maybe kids yelling about breakfast? Well, imagine doing it without electricity, with neighbors peeking from balconies, and the looming rule of church bells that mark every slice of time. As you move through the house, you notice how these women are the timekeepers. Breakfast won't exist if beans aren't soaked the night before or dough kneaded in time for the oven's heat. Men may imagine they run the family, but you can see plainly who's steering the ship. It's the mother deciding whether to stretch a bit of maize into thin tortillas or save the better flour for Sunday. It's the sister who keeps track of which uncle needs flattering to secure a small loan. It's the servant girl, barely more than a child, who carries water before dawn so everyone else can pretend they live in comfort. The air carries a mixture of smells: wood smoke, damp stone, and the faint sourness of yesterday's stew reheated once more. You hear low conversation, mostly women's voices, calculating quietly how much food can be spared for market, how many candles remain for the week, whether the laundry can dry in this damp air. A husband might stroll out later and declare a household decision, but the groundwork was already laid hours before by hands that never stopped moving. Lean closer to the courtyard window, and you'll spot a scene repeated from Buenos Aires to Bogota, a mother fussing over her daughter's hair, twisting braids tight not only for beauty, but to signal discipline to watchful neighbors. Reputation is currency. One loose strand might invite gossip that the household is careless, and gossip spreads faster than a fever. You can almost picture women balancing bowls on their hips while sending coded messages with raised eyebrows, no Facebook groups required. Listen carefully. You might catch the rustle of paper. Somewhere, a girl hides a letter beneath the folds of a shawl, delivered through a cousin, read by candlelight last night, now folded again like a secret heartbeat. Household dawns are not only about chores, but about managing tiny rebellions, the unspoken dreams of daughters who dare to wish for something beyond arranged matches and daily drudgery. Peek into the kitchen, and you'll see the hired cook stirring a pot with the precision of a chemist. Recipes aren't written down. They're sung into the hands of daughters and nieces remembered through rhythm. A pinch of cumin, a splash of vinegar, all recited like prayers. Later in the day, the men may boast about politics in the plaza, but here is where survival gets measured: calories portioned, children fed, leftovers stretched. The first sliver of sunlight hits the floor tiles, and already the day feels older than it is. Behind these closed doors, the rhythm of Latin American life begins not with proclamations in Congress, halls, or military parades, but with women's quiet orchestration. It's a rhythm both tender and tense, filled with prayer calculation. and the kind of patience that holds a whole household upright. The sun is finally up, but you notice the real economy doesn't sparkle in gold coins or government decrees. It lives in the hum of women's invisible labor. You trail a woman as she kneels by a trunk, lifting its creaky lid to reveal a chaos of scraps, half-used candles buttons, saved from worn-out shirts, and a roll of cloth that will someday become either curtains or a child's new skirt. This is her bank. She doesn't own land titles or fat accounts in a colonial bank, but every scrap has value. Imagine if your savings app consisted of leftover soap slivers and recycled jars. You'd laugh, but she'd nod and say yes, exactly. Step out with her to the patio, and you'll see the hidden bartering system in action. Neighbors stop by not with coins, but with chickens' gourds or news of who's willing to lend maize until harvest. The official economy might pretend men are the breadwinners, but you can see how women spin threads of survival. A laundress agrees to wash uniforms in exchange for a small bag of rice. A fruit seller tucks away a few mangoes not for sale, but to bribe the priest into forgiving a late tithe. The flow of goods slips beneath the radar, unacknowledged in ledgers, yet essential for life. Now lean into the kitchen corner, where the money actually rattles. Women sell tamales, empanadas, or cups of chocolate, not just at market stalls, but through windows, doorsteps, and street corners. One famous example from Mexico City women, called chocolateras, made fortunes brewing chocolate drinks for politicians and students alike. Think of them as the Starbucks baristas of their day, except with a little more spice and a whole lot more gossip. You hear one of them laugh softly as she slips an extra dash of cinnamon for her favorite customer. Men, of course, grumble about spending, accusing wives of wasting money on lace or candles. But follow the numbers behind every scolding husband is a woman who already stretched 1 peso into 5. She's the one who knows which vendor gives fair weight, which butcher sneaks fat into the scales, and which shopkeeper allows credit when silver is scarce. Her financial savvy is as sharp as any banker's, though she'd never be allowed behind a desk. Sometimes the economy is literally sewn into clothing. Women stitch secret pockets into petticoats, hiding coins from greedy relatives or even from their own husbands. Letters from courts reveal countless cases of disputes where women insisted, sometimes successfully, that certain hidden earnings were theirs alone. Imagine tucking your savings account inside your jeans hem and never telling your spouse it's not paranoia, it's strategy. Pause a moment at the market plaza. The air smells of ripe bananas dust and roasted maize. Women haggle fiercely, not only over price, but over reputation. A good deal is not just saving 2 reals. It's a public declaration that you are clever, watchful, not easily fooled. These negotiations train daughters too. You catch a small girl tugging her mother's sleeve, whispering, "Is that too much?" The mother raises her chin, counters the vendor, and walks away with both pride and potatoes intact. Consider how much of this labor vanishes from history books. You read accounts of generals, presidents, and landowners, but not of the woman who kept her family from starving by smuggling extra eggs in her basket. Yet she is the economy's backbone. Without her, the coins never stretch, the debts never soften, the meals never appear. Her hands move faster than any printing press, spinning scarcity into sustenance. When you think about your own household, who notices when the rice runs out or when bills pile too high? Chances are it's not the loudest voice at the dinner table. That same dynamic ruled 19th century Latin America. Men debated politics in public squares, but women handled the math that mattered at home. And though invisible, their silent arithmetic made the difference between ruin and resilience. Step beyond the doorway now, into the jostling rhythm of the streets, and you realize that women are not simply cloistered behind walls, they carry the pulse of the city. The plaza is alive with chatter colors and scents that swirl like a carnival. You spot baskets of guavas stacked beside piles of charcoal, while chickens squawk indignantly under makeshift cages. Every shout, every haggle is powered by women who know the true value of a coin and the speed of a rumor. You trail behind a vendor balancing a woven tray of tamales on her head, moving with the grace of a dancer. She pauses, not just to sell, but to exchange tidbits of information: who is courting whom, which soldier has deserted, which neighbor hasn't paid his debts. It's like scrolling a social feed, except the updates come wrapped in banana leaves and sweet steam. Isn't it funny how we think we invented the art of multitasking? She's been doing it for centuries, selling dinner while delivering news. Along one alley, laundry flaps like banners of survival. Women scrub shirts on stones, their arms rhythmic, their laughter carrying across the wash stream. Laundry is no simple task. It's where alliances are forged and secrets whispered. Here, a woman admits her husband gambled away half a paycheck. There another confesses she's hidden money in a clay jar, buried under the lemon tree. You can almost hear the fabric slapping against stone as punctuation for each scandal shared. Glance toward the fruit stalls, and you'll find young girls learning the art of commerce early. They practice quick calculations in their heads, a mental abacus honed sharper than any clerk's. One wrong price and the whole family eats less tonight. Yet these markets also serve as training grounds for confidence. A girl who masters the art of a firm tone and steady gaze won't be easily pushed aside later, whether by a greedy shopkeeper or a heavy-handed official. What about law enforcement? Watch as soldiers on patrol stroll past puffed up with authority. Yet when they stop for a snack, it's the women who set the terms. Coin down. First portion, measured firmly, no exceptions. There's a quiet power here, a subtle resistance that turns public space into women's turf too. They may not hold office, but they command the flow of tortillas and tamales, which is often just as important. Of course, danger lurks as well. Markets are crowded, and pickpockets thrive. Women develop codes and signals to warn one another: a tap on the basket handle, a glance toward the corner, a whispered word that spreads faster than the thief's hand. Imagine a real-time group chat conducted entirely through body language. You'd fit right in if you paid attention. Step toward the church steps, and you'll find another layer of the street economy. Women sell candles, flowers, and small tokens to pilgrims. Each sale is also a moment of conversation, sometimes sly, sometimes heartfelt. The gossip here touches not only neighbors, but priests' politics and the latest decrees read out after Mass. Religion and rumor blend into a single marketplace of words. If you close your eyes, you hear the hum of countless transactions, coins clinking, cloth-rustling gossip floating like incense. These streets are the bloodstream of the city, and women are the red cells pumping information as much as goods. Forget the official gazettes. The fastest way to learn what matters is to listen to the women selling guavas, scrubbing shirts, and handing you a steaming cup of chocolate. Out here, the land itself feels like an unforgiving master, and every woman who steps onto a hacienda, a plantation, or the dry backlands carries scars the earth has carved into her. Dawn doesn't come gently. it slams down with roosters, crackling fires, and the weight of another endless day. Before overseers bark orders, women are already grinding maize, stoking fires, and keeping households running in places where survival is always one bad harvest away. Afro-descendant women in Cuba, indigenous women in Peru, mestiza, women in Mexico. Different names, same hard rhythm, repeated across landscapes that look nothing alike, but demand the same sweat. Follow one woman into the cane fields, and you'll understand what backbreaking really means. She wields a machete sharp enough to shave bark, but dull from overuse, hacking through stalk after stalk while the sun stings her neck. Every swing is a gamble too slow, and she lags behind too fast, and she risks slicing her own arm. It's easy to romanticize the countryside from a distance, but here it's a battlefield between human endurance and nature's sharp edges. Would you last even an hour under that heat, your hands blistering your throat dry as dust? Nearby on the coffee plantations in Brazil, women bend low among glossy leaves, plucking red cherries one by one. Their fingers move quickly, sorting good beans from bad, while babies cry in hammocks tied between trees. The overseer doesn't notice the lullabies hummed in the shade, but those songs stitch sanity into days measured in sacks of beans. Each child grows up with the rhythm of rocking to the beat of survival. For them, playtime is chasing each other around coffee plants, while mothers count wages that never stretch far enough. And then there are the Andean highlands, where indigenous women herd llamas or tend potato fields carved into terraces older than the republics themselves. They wrap themselves in woven shawls bright as sunrise, carrying both infants and seed potatoes in their folds. To outsiders, it looks picturesque, almost like a travel postcard. But listen closely. Those same women sing laments about taxes, debts, and husbands conscripted into armies. Their bright shawls cover calloused shoulders. Their songs carry centuries of resistance in minor keys. Life on haciendas isn't only about crops. It's about hierarchy, carved as sharply as terraces in the earth. At the top sit the patron and his family, often European descended, parading in starched clothes. Below them swirl overseers, clerks, priests. At the bottom, women carry wood milk cows and cook meals that climb all the way back up to those whitewashed dining halls. Some women serve inside as maids, nannies, or cooks living in shadowed corridors. They know the patron's moods, his guests' preferences, and every creak of the big house. If history books called general strategists, then maids were the quiet tacticians of domestic survival. Yet not all was passive endurance. Women shaped backlands life with quiet resistance. Afro-descendant women in Cuba sometimes slowed their pace in the cane fields as subtle protest, knowing overseers couldn't whip everyone at once. Others practiced day stealing, setting aside the best produce, a handful of beans, or an extra chicken egg to feed their own families. Indigenous women preserved rituals, planting according to moon phases, despite landlords scoffing at superstitions. Their knowledge often made the difference between famine and harvest. Who really had the last laugh? When the superstitious method produced the stronger crop. Sometimes defiance was more dramatic. You can trace petitions written to colonial courts by women demanding protection against abusive overseers or unfair debts. One Peruvian woman, Nicolasa, left a paper trail in the 1820s, where she argued she could not pay the inflated charges stacked against her weaving. Her petition is as fierce as any modern lawsuit, her words bristling with the insistence that she would not be swallowed whole by the hacienda system. It's a reminder that literacy, rare as it was for rural women, became a weapon sharper than a machete. The hacienda kitchen deserves a story of its own. Picture a smoky adobe room where pots bubble with stews thickened by beans, cassava, or plantains. Women stir with long wooden spoons, their arms aching while men come and go praising or complaining depending on their appetites. The kitchen is more than a place for food. It's an embassy of survival, a meeting point where women trade recipes, gossip, and sometimes coded complaints about masters and overseers. Too much salt in the stew might be a joke that really means too much interference in their lives. The taste of food became a language subtle but sharp. Haciendas also trained women to be logisticians. Running a household meant juggling supplies stretched thin across miles. If soap ran out, you made your own from ashes and fat. If cloth tore, you unraveled old skirts and rewove the threads. One miscalculation could leave a family short until the next harvest. Think of it as running a company without spreadsheets, where failure meant hunger. The managers of these invisible companies were women, and though unpaid, their calculations built dynasties. And while landowners wrote their names into history, it was women who preserved the rhythms of daily life. They passed down songs, planting techniques, even whispered recipes for herbal remedies, knowledge not recorded in books, but carried in bodies and memories. A grandmother teaching her granddaughter how to heal a cut with crushed herbs, or when to sow beans by the shadow of the mountain. That was history too, just not the kind with statues or parades. Stand for a moment at the edge of the fields as the day ends. The sky burns, orange machetes rest against walls. Children chase each other barefoot through dust. Women wash clothes in river shallows, their voices weaving through the twilight. Tomorrow will demand the same grind, but for now, there's laughter, small stories traded, and the stubborn pride of survival. Out here, on land, both cruel and generous women don't just endure, they carve out quiet kingdoms in the shadows of plantations and haciendas. Slip into the hush of a convent courtyard, and suddenly the world changes tempo. The streets outside may rattle with wagons and gossip, but here the soundscape is softer. Sandals scuffing on stone, the echo of bells, the steady drip of a fountain. Women in veils and long habits glide past, their eyes downcast, but don't let the silence fool you. Behind those walls, devotion becomes a tool, a strategy, even a kind of leverage. Some women entered convents by choice, craving an escape from arranged marriages or the dangers of childbirth that haunted their sisters in secular homes. Others were pushed in by families who couldn't afford dowries or wanted one daughter dedicated to God. Either way, the convent became a paradoxical place, restrictive yet strangely liberating. Here, a woman could learn Latin paint icons, compose music, or manage property opportunities almost impossible outside. Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, the famous Mexican poet and nun a century earlier, had already proven how convent walls could shelter genius. Even in the 19th century, echoes of her defiance lingered. Step into the chapel, and you see women praying fervently before saints' statues, candles flickering in rows like a sea of whispered wishes. But devotion was not only spiritual, it was political. A well-timed novena might rally local women behind a cause. A gift of flowers or wax to a particular saint could quietly signal allegiance. In many towns, the convent wasn't just a holy space. It was a hub of influence, a place where widows, spinsters, and wealthy matrons alike found common ground. And don't forget the Betas devout laywomen who never took full vows but lived semi-religious lives, often wearing plain clothes and dedicating themselves to prayer. They floated between worlds, respected for their piety, yet free to move about. Some became spiritual advisors, wielding influence over powerful men who feared their whispered warnings about sin and salvation. Think of them as consultants, cloaked in modesty more persuasive than any hired lawyer. Pilgrimage sites also created opportunities for women to assert quiet authority. At shrines like Our Lady of Luján in Argentina or the Basilica of Guadalupe in Mexico, women sold candles, offered prayers, and even managed the flow of pilgrims. A healer might station herself near a shrine, blending folk remedies with saintly invocations. For every pilgrim kneeling at the altar, there was often a woman guiding the ritual, suggesting which candle to light, which prayer to say, which donation might ensure a miracle. Was it faith business or both? The line blurred gracefully. Inside convent walls, nuns also managed money. Some institutions owned land-leased properties and ran schools for girls. That meant ledgers, contracts, and negotiations handled by women who outwardly lived lives of poverty and humility. Imagine being told your life was dedicated to self-denial, then spending hours balancing budgets and collecting rent. You might smile at the irony, but these women used it to carve out a rare sphere of autonomy. Then there were the moments of cultural creation. Nuns copied music, embroidered altar cloths, painted devotional art. Their work spilled beyond convent walls, shaping the aesthetic of churches and homes alike. Without their hands, many towns would have lacked both sacred beauty and practical education. Parents sent daughters to convent schools to learn not just reading and writing, but also the social graces needed for survival in polite society. Of course, devotion sometimes clashed with scandal. Rumors of illicit letters, forbidden romances, or political intrigue occasionally drifted from convents. Court cases show nuns accused of everything from sheltering fugitives to spreading dangerous ideas. In Colombia, some women of faith quietly supported independence fighters hiding documents or relaying messages under the guise of religious errands. The veil, it turned out, could conceal more than just a face. It could hide a revolution in progress. Walk once more through the courtyard at dusk. The fountain murmurs. The air smells of wax and flowers. A group of novices chant softly in unison. It looks serene, almost timeless. Yet if you listen past the prayers, you'll hear something else. The rustle of power moving quietly through corridors. The strategies of women who learned to bend sacred rules for worldly survival. Behind every whispered Ave Maria, there might be an unspoken plan. A delicate tug on the threads of society from behind convent walls. You slip back into the busy hum of town life, and suddenly the air feels charged with something more playful, more dangerous, desire always swirling just below the surface. The codes of love here are never written out loud, but stitched into fabric, flicked from a fan, or hidden between lines of a letter. In 19th century Latin America, courtship was less about romance as we picture it, and more about choreography, a constant dance of signals where women had to be fluent or risk everything. Take the fan, for example. To an outsider, it's just a tool to keep cool in sticky heat. But watch carefully, a fan opened wide and waved briskly meant leave me alone. Half closed, brushed against the cheek, that whispered, I like you. Covering the eyes could signal, let's keep this quiet. Imagine translating emojis into flicks of the wrist, only with the added risk that one wrong move could ruin your reputation. Do you think you'd be brave enough to test it? Clothing itself joined the conversation. A carefully chosen shawl might say as much as a letter. Bright embroidery could hint at flirtation, while dark tones suggested mourning or modesty. Boleros, mantillas, lace gloves all became part of a visual language men had to learn to decode. And yet, women controlled the grammar. A well-timed adjustment of a veil could shield an expression or invite one glance too many. Letters carried a different weight altogether. With literacy spreading, but still limited, every note became precious. Women dictated love letters to trusted cousins or friends, knowing a misplaced word could become evidence in a family dispute. Sometimes, whole court cases turned on the discovery of folded scraps tied with ribbon. Judges treated them like smoking guns, while for the women involved, they were simply lifelines of longing. One Argentine woman's trial record preserves the exact wording of her secret notes, proof that desire itself could be dragged into the courtroom. And then there was music. Serenades were not just cliches from old movies. They were real, risky gestures. A man with a guitar beneath a window didn't just risk ridicule. He risked the wrath of fathers and brothers who might chase him away with sticks or worse. For women listening from behind shutters, it was a moment of thrill wrapped in danger. The melody carried more than notes. It carried the possibility of rebellion against the arranged matches negotiated in daylight. But desire didn't only move along sanctioned paths. Forbidden attachments flickered in the margins, relationships across class lines, across racial categories, or simply across parental disapproval. Some ended in scandal, others in hurried marriages designed to repair honor. Records from Chile and Mexico alike show women hauled before church courts for accusations of clandestine affairs. The fan signals and shawl choices suddenly turned into damning evidence. Yet behind the stern language of judges, you can glimpse women who dared to test the boundaries of who they could love. Even within marriages, codes persisted. Public displays of affection were frowned upon, so couples developed discreet languages, a hand pressed briefly in a crowded church, a shared glance at the market, or the strategic seating of chairs at social gatherings. The line between duty and desire blurred, constantly negotiated daily in gestures that outsiders might miss. Think about your own time. How many apps, texts, and emojis do we rely on to signal interest, rejection, or affection? Now imagine doing all of that without words in a society where even eye contact might spark a rumor. The courage it took to wink to write, or to slip a fan, just so it makes your modern scene at 11:32 p.m. drama look tame. Step back now and watch the plaza again. Women stroll in pairs, their shawls tucked close, their fans moving rhythmically. Men linger at corners, pretending to discuss politics, but really waiting for a glance. The air seems ordinary, but beneath it flows a current of coded messages, a symphony of silent flirtations and carefully hidden flames. It's a theater where every gesture counts, and women more often than not direct the play. Gunfire cracks in the distance, banners whip in the wind, and hungry soldiers trudge through the dust. But look closely, and you'll see who's really keeping the war alive. Behind the columns of men march women with baskets, pots, and babies slung on their backs, their skirts dragging through the mud as steady as any drumbeat. Generals might get the statues, but without these silent logisticians, most armies would have collapsed before firing a single shot. They were known by many names: soldaderas, in Mexico rabonas, in Peru palilas, in Chile. Each nickname carried a story often half dismissive, as though society struggled to admit how essential they really were. To the men who wrote history, these women were background noise. To the men who actually fought, they were the reason meals appeared, wounds closed, and morale held together. You trail behind one of them now, her shawl bulging suspiciously, though inside are not tortillas, but cartridges wrapped in cloth. She moves with practiced ease the face of a vendor heading to market, while in reality, she carries tomorrow's firepower. Pause at a campfire after a day's march. Soldiers slump half asleep, but women stir pots of beans and meat rationing carefully. One spoonful too much, and the next morning someone goes hungry. The line between sustenance and starvation is measured with ladles, and women's math is the only thing standing between an army and despair. Doesn't it feel familiar, the way unseen calculations hold families together even today? Who stretches groceries? Who notices the bills stacking up, or simply magnified that same invisible labor? Some women push their roles further. In Colombia, Policarpa Salavarieta, known simply as La Pola, spun webs of intelligence during the independence wars. She carried messages hidden in her hair, passed on supply routes, and warned rebels of enemy movements. When captured, she faced execution in 1817. Eyewitnesses remembered her fiery last words condemning her captors and calling on others to continue the fight. Her defiance echoes even now, a reminder that logistics and courage often wore skirts and shawls. Not every story ended in martyrdom. Many women survived by mastering disguise. A bread seller in Peru slips through checkpoints, each loaf hollowed and packed with gunpowder. A washerwoman in Mexico City delivers laundry bundles with letters stitched into seams. An indigenous woman in Bolivia whispers news of troop movements as though reciting a prayer. Authority looks straight through them, blinded by assumptions that women belonged only to the margins. And that blindness gave them power. Nursing, too, became a battlefield of its own. Picture the chaos after combat. Smoke clings to the air, groans ripple through the wounded, and men clutch at their torn uniforms. Women rush forward, tearing strips from skirts to use as bandages, boiling herbs into crude antiseptics, murmuring prayers over feverish soldiers. Some learned their craft in convent infirmaries, others improvised remedies with whatever plants grew nearby. A wound stitched in dim light with shaking hands wasn't just medical work. It was an act of defiance against despair. Even at home, far from cannons, women shouldered wartime burdens. Letters tell of mothers managing farms alone, bribing officials to spare sons from conscription, or hiding valuables from roaming armies. Some wrote petitions to governments demanding compensation for food seized by soldiers. These were not passive victims. They were strategists negotiating survival under shifting regimes. A widow in Argentina once itemized every sheep and sack of grain taken from her land, presenting the government with a bill that reads less like a plea and more like a lawsuit. And what of morale? Armies didn't just need food and ammunition. They needed stories, songs, and comfort. Women told jokes, sang ballads, and reminded men why they fought. A whispered tale of home, a lullaby hummed while stirring a pot, could steady nerves better than a general speech. Think about the last time you felt fear. Wasn't it a calm voice that grounded you more than statistics or orders? That was the quiet battlefield women commanded. But don't romanticize it too much. Their labor came at cost. Exhaustion, hunger, assault, abandonment. Many suffered deeply, their names lost in the churn of wars that preferred to glorify sabers and horses. For every remembered heroine, countless others trudged nameless, their contributions absorbed and forgotten. Yet look closely, and you find their fingerprints everywhere, in the survival of armies, in the preservation of families, in the fragile victories that built new republics. Night falls on the encampment. Fires flicker low, shadows stretch across weary faces, and soldiers dream uneasy dreams. Women keep watch, stirring the last of the pot, soothing a baby, tucking a musket under a blanket for safekeeping. Tomorrow, the march resumes, the battles rage on, and history will write itself with generals' names. But you standing here know the truth. Behind every victorious banner, fluttering in the morning wind, is a woman's unseen hand steadying the pole. By the time the campfires fade and the road dust settles, you find yourself in a quieter theater of survival kitchens that smell of mint and smoke patios, bright with drying herbs, and small back rooms where women turn pain into stories the body can understand. Curanderas, parteras, comadronas, healers, and midwives move through this space like conductors, hearing the offbeat notes of fevers, fainting spells, and fears that don't fit in any ledger. If the plaza traded rumors and the battlefield traded orders here, the currency is trust. You sit beside a low table, and an older woman touches your wrist, not just to count your pulse, but to read the worry you brought with you. Watch how she organizes her tools, sprigs of ruta and manzanilla, a little bag of ground coca leaves brought from a cousin in the highlands, a jar of honey, clean cloths boiled and dried, a rosary polished by years of use. She doesn't speak in complicated terms, yet her practice is strangely systematic. She asks about last night's dreams, the weather, the fight you had with your brother, the fright your child took when the dog barked too close, because in her model of the world, susto, shock that rattles the soul can bruise the body as surely as a fall from a ladder. You nod along, surprised by how precisely she maps emotion onto muscle. Midwives carry the same blend of tenderness and precision. You follow one across a neighborhood at dusk, summoned by a knock that says more than words. She arrives with a small bundle, oils, linens, a candle, and the practiced calm of someone who has seen labor tilt from ordinary to dangerous and back again. Without fuss, she checks the mother's breath, listens to the rhythm of contractions, and recruits aunties and neighbors into a choreography. Boil more water. Warm, the linens, open the window, close it when the breeze turns. Modern hospitals will one day call this teamwork. Parteras already built it from kinship. Not all knowledge lives in jars and bundles. Some of it travels in prayers. A midwife ties a red ribbon on a bedpost to distract the envy, or murmurs an appeal to the Virgin to soften the pain. Does it work? Well, ask the women who breathe easier when the candle stays steady, who relax when a familiar psalm wraps around the room like a shawl. If you've ever held someone's hand through a hard night, you already know how ritual steadies the body. Faith here is not a substitute for skill. It is a rhythm that lets skill do its work. You may catch a glimpse of paperwork too. As cities grow, officials try to tug healing under the umbrella of regulation. In capitals from Mexico City to Buenos Aires, town councils and medical professors argue that births should move into supervised spaces and that midwives should pass exams. Some parteras take the test, collect certificates, and fold them carefully between pages of a prayer book. Others continue by reputation alone, because 20 safe deliveries in the same alley still counts louder than any stamp. A police officer might demand to see authorization. The grandmother at the door will simply say, "She delivered all my grandchildren." Which credential will the laboring mother choose? Doctors and priests circle this world sometimes as allies, sometimes as skeptics. A young physician fresh from European lectures speaks sharply about superstition, yet finds himself calling a curandera when his own patient refuses to calm under his instruments. A priest denounces charms from the pulpit, but sends a message the next week. A child in the parish is wasting away. Can the healer bring a tisane for appetite? Reality blurs the categories. In many towns, the most successful practitioners speak both dialects, one for the examination room, one for the kitchen bench. You remember how women turned devotion into leverage in the convents. Here they do the same with medicine. Public health campaigns bring another layer. In the early decades, royal expeditions carried the smallpox vaccine across oceans and mountains, and as the 19th century took hold, local authorities tried to keep the chain unbroken. Who kept babies steady in line on market day? Who spread the word that the arm would ache only briefly? Women again. Mothers, midwives, church wardens, turning state policy into something the neighborhood could accept. You can almost see a comadrona tapping a tin basin to gather attention. Hold still. We're doing this, so your child will live. No press release could beat that. Healers also attend to ailments with names that slide around the edges of textbooks. Empacho the belly's stubborn knot, mal de ojo, the gaze that sours a baby's sleep, and the sadness that creeps after loss. You watch a cleansing with an egg rolled gently across the forehead and chest, then cracked in a glass of water to read the bubbles and threads. A skeptic might scoff, but the patient breathes easier, the crying subsides, and the household resets to ordinary time. If you've ever needed a ritual to mark the end of a hard week, you already understand what's happening. And then there's the ledger of life and death written with midwives' hands. They tracked due dates by moon cycles, guessed fetal positions with their palms, and listened for trouble in the pauses between contractions. When labor went long, they repositioned mothers, massaged back, coaxed with herbal teas. When a delivery turned dangerous, they shouted for strong arms and steadied the room with a voice that meant business. Not all endings were gentle, and grief lived close by, but Parteras learned to carry families through the worst without closing the door on future hope. It's one thing to save a life. It's another to save a household's courage. Legal records occasionally show these women defending their work. A healer sued for defamation after a rival called her ignorant. A midwife testified in court about a birth gone wrong. Her calm answers cutting through a lawyer's bluster. Reading those pages, you hear the same cadence as the market and the war camp women stating facts tough and clear, unwilling to be erased from the story they keep writing with their labor. You glance back at the little table where you started. The jar of honey sits next to folded linen. The sprigs of ruta look like small green lightning, and the rosary glints as if someone polished each bead with patience. Outside, a neighbor calls, and the healer stands already halfway into the next problem: an infant's fever, a grandfather's cough, a girl too frightened to sleep. The house smells of mint and steam, and you catch yourself breathing in time with the room. The science may change in the next century. The instruments will gleam brighter. Certificates will multiply. But the heartbeat, you hear the one that says, bodies are stories, and care as a craft will travel forward, carried by women who know how to listen with their hands. You slide into a cool notarial office, lime-washed walls, a heavy desk, polished by generations of elbows, and realize the archive is less dusty museum and more toolbox. Women come here with bundles of folded paper names, of witnesses on their tongues, and a calm that says, "I've rehearsed this 3 times already." The clerk dips his pen, the scratch starts, and you watch as everyday life turns into legal armor. Wills, dowries, guardianships, support claims, slander suits, inked shields to protect property, children, and names. Start with a notary, the escribano, who is part scribe, part therapist. He listens to a widow explain which field she will leave to which child, and you notice how precisely she describes borders, the orange tree, the low stone wall, the ditch that floods in April. Land isn't just land. It's memory with measurements. She adds a clause about a granddaughter's schooling 2 years paid from the rental of a storeroom, and the notary nods. If you've ever scribbled, and if this then that note for a babysitter, you got the spirit. Wills let women choreograph the future, even when civil codes stack the deck. Turn a page, and you find capitulaciones matrimoniales, prenuptial agreements. A young bride arrives with her mother, and an aunt who never misses a loophole. They list the dote dowry, and the bienes paraphernales paraphernal goods property she brings into marriage that stays legally hers. Sound fussy? It's insurance. Under many 19th century codes, Chile's 1855 Civil Code, Mexico's 1870 and 1884 codes, Argentina's 1869 code, husbands often administered community property, but wives could ring-fence certain assets. A shawl may be romance. A clause is survival. Would you trust your future to compliments alone, or would you prefer a paragraph with a seal? Now meet the mother, filing a juicio de alimentos, a support suit. She presents receipts for maize soap and the child's shoes, each item a small testimony that care costs. The judge asks dry questions. She answers with weather reports. The rain spoiled the bean's school notes. He missed lessons when he had no shoes, and the kind of math markets taught her years ago. Courts loved columns of numbers. Women learned to stack those columns like bricks. Honor matters here too, and gossip from the plaza suddenly wears a legal wig. Slander and insult injurias could ruin prospects, so women sued to defend their names. Read one complaint from a port town, a neighbor accused a seamstress of being unserious code that could scare away clients. The suit walks through witnesses, the priest who saw her at Mass, the shopkeeper who vouches for her accounts, the widow who says the seamstress cared for her during a fever. Reputation becomes evidence cross-stitched by testimony. Remember the laundry line grapevine from the market. In court, that same network flips from rumor mill to defense team. The archive also holds petitions that smell like gunpowder residue from the wars you just left behind. Widows of soldiers file for pensions listing the dates their husbands marched the regiments they served, the rations they were promised and never received. Some women attach letters from colonels. Others bring witnesses who swear the man died on campaign. In Bolivia and the Argentine Northwest, files echo with names tied to guerrilla columns. You encounter a woman invoking Juana Azurdui's example to argue that the Republic owes its debt not only to men with sabers, but to families that furnished mules, blankets, and bread. The tone is not pleading, it's invoicing. Then there are petitions braided with emancipation. In Brazil, where slavery persisted until 1888, women wrote and negotiated alforria manumission letters for themselves or their children. Some paid in installments. Others argued for freedom promised in a former owner's will. After 1871, when the Lei du Ventre Libre declared that children born to enslaved women were legally free mothers, hauled that Latin phrase into everyday Portuguese, and marched it straight to registry offices. Freedom on paper still needed a guardian schooling and food, so you see guardianship requests layered on top. The law makes a door. Women push it open and hold it with a shoulder. Across the Caribbean and into northern South America, you find traces of coartation, a self-purchase system in which enslaved people bought their freedom in parts. Women kept notebooks, prices, payments, witnesses, and when a dispute erupted, those humble ledgers turned into courtroom blades. A baker's wife testifies that she saw silver change hands on market day. A child recalls the phrase the owner used one more part, and you're done. Memory notarized becomes a crowbar against denial. Marriage, despite sermons, wasn't always forever in the legal sense, and archives show separations, annulments, and depositos de mujer cases where a father or husband asked a judge to place a woman in a house of seclusion for her protection during disputes. Read closely, and you hear women arguing back unsafe households, cruel discipline, impossible debts. Clerical courts still handled some marital knots in the early decades. Civil tribunals later took more of that load. Either way, you see women assembling proof. Bruised furniture, not bodies. Broken locks. Neighbors who heard shouting. The priest who counseled a pause. The line between private and public wobbles, and women steady it with affidavits. Property fights can be surprisingly tender. A grandmother bequeaths a loom with the patterns my mother taught me, and a court later must decide whether the loom counts as ordinary furniture or as an income-generating tool reserved for a specific granddaughter. The testimony becomes a miniature history of labor. How many shawls a month? What price at the December fair? Which merchant paid cash? Which paid in credit and onions? Tell me your objects without telling me your life. That's what a will asks, and women answer in paragraphs that smell like wool and dye. Sometimes the paper trail is a map of travel. A teacher applies for a permit to open a girls' school in a coastal town. A midwife registers her certificate so she can move with her married daughter. A seamstress records a power of attorney before leaving for a border city to find work with the new railroad. The 19th century loves its boundaries, but the ink keeps slipping across them. You remember the shrine courtyards and the market stalls. The same voices now echo in petitions that claim space in classrooms and clinics. Law can be a wall. It can also be a ladder. In Chile, Andrés Bello's civil code gathered rules into elegant chapters. Elegant or not, women learned where the footholds were paraphernal property. Here guardianship, their testamentary freedom, over in that corner. In Mexico City, women who couldn't afford fees filed amparo de pobreza to have costs waived, turning poverty itself into legal standing. The trick was never just knowing the rule. It was knowing how to narrate a life so a rule would recognize it. You close one thick volume, and the room exhales dust and sunlight. Beyond the door, the city keeps humming vendors calling bells marking the hour. But in here, you've watched ordinary lives become legible to power one sentence at a time. The clerks sand their pages to dry the ink. The notary ties a ribbon around a stack of wills. A mother folds her copy and tucks it into the same shawl where she once hid a letter from a serenade. The archive isn't a mausoleum. It's a workshop where women convert memory into law rumor, into testimony, and daily bread into enforceable claims. When the next petitioner steps forward, you already know the choreography speaks steadily. List witnesses ask for the seal. Paper, please, and keep the rib tight. The pier smells of salt and wet rope. A steam whistle shrieks, and you catch that first pang of possibility that hits whenever a coastline becomes a doorway. Women step onto gangways with shawls knotted tight and faces set like compasses, not away from home, but toward somewhere new. A trunk holds more than clothes. It holds a revised script, teacher seamstress, performer shopkeeper roles, packed alongside rosaries and recipes in case the map lies. You've heard markets sing and haciendas grind. Now you feel borders flex as women turn movement itself into a craft. Watch a teacher in a dark dress pin her certificate inside the lining of her bodice. She's been hired by a provincial school in a river town where the ink is still drying on the new curriculum. Steamships made this kind of leap possible. Montevideo, to Rosario, Veracruz, to Tampico, Valparaiso, up the coast in careful hops. Escuelas normales multiplied in the mid to late 19th century, and women rode those ladders. In Argentina, reformers championed classrooms. In Mexico, normal schools trained young maestras who would carry slates and stubbornness into villages. Think of today's onboarding manuals, then imagine writing them while hauling your own chalk through rain. Performers trace a different circuit. A troupe loads costumes into crates velvets, for drama cotton, for comedy, a single battered guitar that always sounds braver on opening night. Theater houses, from Lima's Plazuela del Teatro to Mexico City's Teatro Principal, booked women who could slip between roles with a turn of the wrist. Actresses courted applause and scrutiny in equal measure, lauded in papers one week, lectured from pulpits the next. They learned the same skill the market women mastered: set the terms, hold the gaze, count the coins twice. Do you ever feel that strange mixture of stage fright and resolve before a big leap? They lived on that tightrope. Some crossings are less theatrical and more relentless. Through the Andean passes, widows follow mule trains, setting up boarding tables where broth and bread become cash and protection. Down in Patagonia's windswept sheep country, migrants' camps fill with women who mend, cook, and keep small shops, converting weather reports into purchase orders. In the tropics, the rubber boom pulls families toward Iquitos and Manaus. A woman who once traded plantains now tallies kerosene mosquito nets and bright ribbons for river paydays. She learns the seasons of floods as carefully as a school timetable. Borders look like lines on a map until a river rises and redraws your schedule. Ports act like sieves. In Havana and Veracruz, on the isthmus between Colón and Panama City, women weave new networks overnight. Cooks feeding dock workers, laundresses, claiming sunny corners, vendors mastering 3 prices: 1 for locals, 1 for sailors, 1 if you're in a hurry. French canal dreams stalled in the 1880s, but the influx of workers left trails of opportunity and risk. A woman who senses trouble can fold her stall in a heartbeat, pivot to selling coffee from a window, and whisper to friends when patrols look too curious. You can hear the old logistics of war life beating inside this peacetime hustle. Exile and return mark the century's pulse. Manuela Science. So fierce in the independence, era ended far from Quito, running a small shop in Paita Rye, and unbowed her life, reduced by officials but enlarged by the stories she kept. Juana Manuela Guridi crossed and recrossed the Andes, hosting salons where writers and reformers traded ideas that traveled faster than carriages. Clorinda Mato de Turner faced backlash for her prose and slipped into Argentina to continue printing words that still sting. Nícia Floresta pushed for girls' education in Brazil, then carried those arguments across oceans and back again. You've watched petitions become armor. Now you watch passports, or their ad hoc equivalents, become oars. Frontiers are not only between nations. A woman who steps from domestic service into a classroom crosses a boundary as real as any customs line. A seamstress who opens a storefront near a railway station discovers that timetables can be allies. The evening train equals a rush of coats to repair. The Sunday excursion means ribbons and gloves will move. A midwife who registers her certificate in a new town translates trust into the language of official stamps, the same way she once translated contractions into instructions. Remember the notary's ribbon in Section 9. Tie it here to the steamship's mooring line, a neat bow-holding motion and law together. There's also the border. You can't draw reputation. In a new city, a woman carries a portable biography told in small proofs, how fast she can calculate change, how calmly she answers an insult, how many names she can swap at the fountain without repeating a rumor. A single generous act, tending a feverish neighbor through the night, travels farther than any advertisement. Think about your own moves when you arrived somewhere new. What spoke first for you? Your paperwork or the story someone told after meeting you? The century edges toward fresh inventions, telegraph clicks, crossing mountains, photographs pinning faces to paper, newspapers multiplying like sparrows, and women fold these technologies into the old arts. A teacher posts exam results in a window to draw new families. A performer sends her carte de visite ahead like a calling card from the future. A shopkeeper reads the telegraphed grain prices and buys a day early. No one calls this disruption. They call it staying afloat. Those fan signals from Section 6. They don't disappear. They just learn to live beside ink prints and wiretaps. Of course, not every horizon opens cleanly. Some women meet checkpoints staffed by men who confuse authority with whim. A basket is dumped. A trunk pried, a curt question, demands a paper that never existed. The same patience that measured rations by ladle now measures the temperature of the moment. Argue here, wait there, smile. If it disarms, stare straight. If it doesn't. When the gate finally creaks, she steps through without ceremony, because ceremony costs time. If she must, she rebuilds a household with 3 objects, pot, shawl, ledger, and begins again by the clock tower. Stand once more on the pier at dusk. Crates thump, ropes groan, gulls sketch ragged circles in a sky that can't decide on color. A girl leans on a railing hair, reading a letter that says, "There's work in a town you can reach by morning, if you board now." She folds the page into her pocket, glances at the ticket window, and calculates the old, invisible math. Money left cousin's address, the chance of rain, the possibility of starting over with the skills she already owns. Do you step forward with her, or do you wait for the next boat? Either way, you know the procedure. Tie the shawl, keep the papers dry, and carry the map in your head where no guard can seize it. Close your eyes and drift with them. Market whispers, courtyard prayers, coded fans, midnight letters, quiet logistics, healing hands, brave petitions, and salt-scented horizons. You walk beside women who measured time with ladles, stitched law into ribboned pages, and kept revolutions fed while the world looked elsewhere. Let the time